We are here in the question section of our session. We have about 25 minutes left. So again, you can see that there's a question box on the right side of your GoToWebinar control panel. Just if you type a question, I'll see it immediately. So please let me know if you want to direct your questions, and please put it in your question, who you want to direct it to, or if it's okay for the whole panel. I know some of you have been submitting questions that are very specific to certain presentations, and a few of you have more broad overview questions. The first question I wrote down on my piece of paper here is actually the same one posed by IWRA member David Brooks, and he puts it much more eloquently than I could, so I think I'll just use his question. It's kind of a broad question for the whole panel, so anyone on the panel, please feel free to respond, and remember to unmute your microphone when you begin speaking. He asks, and this is to my point as well, the WEF nexus is really a WEF nexus with the added E meaning environment. However, with a few exceptions, as with increased carbon release, there's been little attention to environmental impacts from the speakers. And he asks, how can this environment question be improved further? How can it be extended for further analysis? And I kind of want to ask, how can we even position the environment to be higher in policymakers' outcomes, and particularly looking at normative outcomes. So if anyone could respond, we're interested.
Scott, may I volunteer a
Please do.
response to that? Thank you for the question. This is it's frequently asked question, and others would say instead of environment, they would say climate change. Others would say population growth, and yet nutrition instead of food. So there are so many other dimensions that could be considered. My personal view on this is that we need to keep the analytics simple, because as you add dimensionality to the analytics, the complexity goes geometric. So we need to keep a handle on the analytics and the interlinkages and keep it to the primary resources management and allocation and interlinkages. That's one. And my response is not saying that we should not include environment, we should not include climate change, health, population, demography, and all of the other stresses, technology. All of these are certainly important, and they are included. The question is, are they included as a core analytics, or are they included as a system boundary or system stresses or constraint? I would rather use the latter than the former in terms of including them, because of the simplicity that we need to maintain, because the system is very complex already, and I would not dismiss any of the important elements, but I would stress that we need to keep it manageable, otherwise it will be impossible to track.
Would anyone else like to respond? Bassel, you have to unmute your microphone.
I would just like to re-emphasize one point that Dr. Rabi mentioned, which is resource allocation. So we're trying to guide or help decision makers better allocate the resources. So if we limit it to helping them understand the interconnections between water, energy, and food, and how to better allocate those and make decisions and plans for those, while looking at the externalities and the implications of that allocation on the environment, on the health, while looking at adopting different technologies, that could be one way, one simplification to look at it.
If I may add just one point, I agree with both points. But I think sometimes it could be context specific, where the environment aspect might come out strong. For instance, if you are in the context that I just described earlier, salinity can become a very big issue, so that can come out. But at the same time, it's also possible that these environmental factors can really fit into the food or agricultural wing of of the nexus. So I think it's important to be flexible to make it context specific.
Okay, excellent. Jeri, did you have an input or?
I think everyone said that very well. Certainly a complex system, and I've always thought of the water availability piece as being really reflective of the environment. So you get at least a flavor of the environmental issues involved, but I agree it is going to be really complicated if you start adding in more factors.
Excellent, good. Jeri, if you have, since I can't see you, it's a little harder for me to know when you jump in. So make sure you just jump in and say any questions right away. And,
you bet.
All right, we have a question from Samir Saifa, who asks, I think this was more directed towards Bassel's presentation, but anyone can respond. He says, why focus on ecosystem services? Why not develop common metrics for measuring the state of biodiversity? And then he later asks, in the tool that you presented about, was the water footprint considered, or was it just the water used for crop production, such as the amount used just for irrigation?
Thank you, Scott. With the calculations that we did for the water, we looked at the water requirements for irrigation. For irrigation, and we also looked at the small amount of rainfall that exists there, which also was included in the calculation. So, but we mainly looked, we mainly looked at the water requirement for growing the different food products and under different types of agriculture. So we looked at data we had on open field agriculture versus also growing them in greenhouses, and not only looking at the water requirement for those, but also the energy cost that comes with each.
Okay, excellent. Now, that tool is available on the internet for anyone to use freely?
Yes, it is available online at wefnexustool.org, and anyone could go create an account. And currently, we on that specific website, we have the portfolio or the different data for Qatar. So it allows you to create scenarios for Qatar, play with different food self-sufficiency scenarios, choose different water sources, choose different energy sources, and be able to assess the trade-offs between the different scenarios, and be able to also anticipate different policy preferences and how would that reflect on favoring one scenario over another.
Could you give us that website again one more time, just real slowly?
WEF Nexus Tool, one word, wefnexustool.org, and you could also find that the tool with description on it and further information on different publications that are around it on the wefnexus.tamu.edu, which is our research group's website, where you'll find a lot of the information and the case studies that our research group is currently working on.
Excellent, thank you. I think that answers a couple questions that we've had. People were asking where to find that tool. Another question that I had written down and then was here actually. Oh, yes, Rabi.
I just typed in on the chat if you all can see it.
Ah, excellent, thank you.
Sorry.
No, it's good. Thank you. Like I said, we had several questions come in asking how can we find this tool, how can we use this tool, so how can we learn more? So I'm glad we were able to answer that. Like I said, here a question I kind of had, and another question coming in here from Stephanie Galanti is sort of she wants to put the three case studies into conversation with each other, and that's kind of what I'd like to see. If is there a way can these different case studies, the Qatar study, the New Mexico study, Pakistan study, Can they teach each other something? Can there something to be learned from each of them? Have a dialogue amongst yourselves, if you could, about what maybe each of these studies says to the other study, or can be applied more globally. I know we've discussed that each of these are very specific, site-specific situations, but at the same time, I think we recognize there's some broader lessons to be learned. So maybe we could talk.
One thing that I'd like to put on the table for us to discuss and maybe debate, one lesson I take home on the Nexus is that solutions are local, because conditions are, everything is connected, but the connection are very much site-specific. So that's one major lesson. The other thing that even though the solutions are specific and the connectivity between these primary resources and how water, energy, food are connected is local, what we can learn is the process of thinking, the inclusiveness in that discussion, and the platform that can be shared. But I think we need to balance. I don't think we can promote solutions that work in California and how can we move them into Pakistan and vice versa. But there are some guiding principles that maybe can be shared. There's a global data, global knowledge that I mentioned that is in every meeting we have in this Nexus community. It comes again that we may need to have a shared platform to share these experiences, data, knowing that the solutions at the end of the day are very much local.
That's a good point. Some of it I'll remember. Does anyone else on our panel like to speak to that?
This is Jeri. I think one of the things that I agree with Rabi entirely, in that ultimately the water issues involved here are very local. Unless you have unlimited energy for transportation and unlimited ability to move water around, you are going to be working within a relatively small region, which is why we stuck with 3 counties, and that was almost too big in some ways. I'd like the idea that there might be a commonality of metrics, and even something as simple as a commonality of units. I mean, when I'm working in the US, I'm still bouncing between acre feet, meters cubed, gallons per day, you name it. And then, of course, when I start to work with international, then we're back up to metric, which makes the most sense. But different users of water use different units. Water managers in agriculture might use acre feet. Guys who work at water treatment plants use gallons per day or 1,000,000 gallons per day, for example. But and then the metrics issue is very, very important. You know, when we have withdrawals, what does a withdrawal really constitute? What does that mean? What is a consumptive withdrawal versus another type of withdrawal? So those kinds of metrics, if they are standardized, will certainly facilitate better communication among these kinds of teams.
Excellent, good point, and good suggestion to always use metric as well. Does anyone else have a response?
I think one small point that I want to mention is, I agree with both points, and one thing I learned from the other presentations and research is the scale. I might be working on household level or community level issues. Someone else is working at macro level between industry trade-offs, and the trade-offs are happening at different scales everywhere. And sometimes it's between firms and farmers, sometimes it was between regions, between industries, and I think there is a lot to learn from others by just the share of the scale at which the study is being done.
One thing I'd also like to add on what I personally learned from looking at different Nexus case studies and experiences is the way we're communicating that scientific know-how or that understanding of those trade-offs with the different stakeholders, whether they're farmers, whether they're policymakers, whether they're water utility managers. How is this science and this nexus understanding that is developed by each of these case studies communicated with these decision makers so that it could then be translated into whether policies or change in practices.
Excellent, thank you for that. You know, another question here is coming from Samir Saifa, and kind of wants to frame work within the WEF nexus in relation to system limits, and that whole body of literature, particularly around like planetary boundaries, and you know how much can be used. You know, what are the maximum withdrawals? Do any of you feel like comfortable responding to, you know, we just talked about, I think, in the response case study, so how about something at the global scale or a broader scale?
I mean, maybe I'd like to have a take at that. At the global scale, I mean, we have been looking at the boundaries in our case study, for example, in Qatar. We looked at the different resource boundaries, but at the national scale. So I think there's a common theme in terms of the resources that you want to look at in terms of the boundaries and have those as constraints to possibilities of growth, to keep those in mind. So, and have that holistic understanding of what would certain growth in certain sector mean into what implications would it have on the different resource systems and the different boundaries that you have at the scale that you're looking at. I think it gets more complicated when you look at the global picture, because I don't think there's one global decision-making entity that you're able to manage your use of these resources at the global scale and better capture those interconnections globally. So the framework of and the understanding of the interconnections of the resources could be generic and could be customized to be applied in different places, but then the application needs to be local, and the resources need to be localized.
I would also add one dimension, that the interplay between local and global is there. I'll give an example. Bassel talked about the case study in Qatar. The virtual water trade constitute 90% of the water footprint in the food security for the state of Qatar. So that by itself is a interplay between the local solution and how does it trickle in terms of the global, because the watershed in Qatar goes all the way to the US, because that's where some of the grain is coming, and to Australia and other countries. So that boundary, even though it's not explicit in the nexus as a thinking, but because of the portfolio that you have to account for all of these dimensions, it's already there. The other thing that I'd like to pinpoint is that in that interplay between local and global, one of the big opportunities I see for the Nexus community in general to make a global statement is in the implementation of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Already the discussions have started with many of the UN agencies that you cannot approach the SDGs in silos, whether you're looking at transboundary or whether you're looking at local implementation. So that dynamics, we're at the beginning of that dynamics, and we're going to see more of the local global interplay in the Nexus discussion.
Excellent, thank you. Did anyone else want to comment on that? Okay. Well, that's okay. I think what we're going to do here, we have a few more questions, but all of these questions that remain are very specific to certain aspects of the presentations, certain presentations, addressing technical questions about procedure, methodology, your findings. So what I'm going to do is ask that the people who have asked these questions, if you could go ahead and just address them offline to our respective panelists. I believe everyone has had their email address in the presentations or otherwise are able to be found on the internet thanks to Google. Go ahead and address your questions, to those very specific questions, to those people who you'd like to engage in conversation. And hopefully this will be a learning opportunity to extend the webinar to opportunities beyond this short 90 minutes. And I'll just go ahead and ask our panelists to we can just do once more round. If there's any summation thoughts, any summary ideas, things that you've taken away from the webinar, new insights perhaps that have been gained, or any final points that you'd really like to just sort of drive home. You could just go ahead and just go through and once again just give it 1 or 2 minutes just your final thoughts. I can start with you, Rabi.
Sure. Really, thank you. This has been, I was hoping we'll have more dynamic interaction because it's difficult to do that when you are miles away. I encourage all of you to be engaged. I think we are at the beginning of realizing the dimensions of the Nexus. Going back in history, when this was first proposed as a conceptual framework, it was not adopted by the academic community. Academic community first were skeptical whether this is going to take off. And it was, unlike many other disciplines, emerged out of a need from the policy side, from the industry, which were more agile and more flexible in taking on integrating their water energy sectors. I give many examples in the water energy that companies has realized that way before the academics, and then the policymaker and the resource scarcity stresses forced the policymakers and the head of states. I remember the discussion back in Davos in 2011, realizing that interconnectedness, and they pushed the agenda. Unlike many other areas that we've seen, the Nexus has been driven by outside the academia. So only recently there has been a movement in the academic institution realizing that need. And I would expect that we're at the tipping point, the tip of the iceberg in terms of realizing what are the research gaps, what are the data needs, what are the framework to look into this new emerging discipline. And I think that it's exciting to see that unfolding. Thank you.
Thank you. Bassel?
I'd like to end with further building on the idea of localizing the Nexus and looking not only at the local resources and how they interplay, but also being able to model that Nexus by looking at the local resources, but also at the critical question that we're trying to ask stakeholders involved, the scale at which we're demonstrating that interaction, whether it's local, whether it's at the national scale or regional, the systems that are involved, and what are we trying to assess, in addition to how do we want to communicate that message with the different stakeholders and different policymakers. So it's a combination of all of the above, basically, in order to identify specific relevant tools or way to model a Nexus case study.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Jeri, Sullivan?
Yeah, I think I agree with both Rabi and Bassel. I think there is a lot that still remains to be done. I'm very gratified that the academic community and funding agencies are starting to take these questions up, because when you pull on one of the strings, the energy or the water or the food string, then the other ones respond, and we're learning more and more. From a national laboratory standpoint, we're big into security, and all of these aspects are extremely important with respect to each other in terms of energy security, water security, and food security. And I think that's one of the key things that policymakers are going to want to understand. They want to make all of these aspects secure for their constituencies. And so I'm looking forward to the funding agencies recognizing this and putting resources to it.
Excellent, thank you. And finally, Dawit.
I mean, it's been very good webinar for me, and in terms of, I think it's still at early stage. There is a lot of work required in terms of methodology, in terms of developing indicators, as Professor Mohtar earlier described. And I also see a lot of requirements for data. It's great that Bassel has made the tool online, but I think we also need more things like that, collaboration in terms of data, models, and so on. If you think, for instance, if you want to see the data that we used for this paper, it is publicly available at www.ifpri.org, and almost all the household level surveys that we collect in many countries are publicly available to download and use. So I think that could be helpful.
Excellent, thank you. Well, this wraps it up for this webinar. We'll be doing another session on these same issues, but with a different set of presenters in 8.5 hours. So if anyone is interested in joining us, it'll be midnight here in Vancouver, but hopefully it'll be a better hour for you. We can continue this discussion then. I personally would like to thank our panel. So thank you, Professor Rabi Mohtar, Bassel Dahir, Jeri Sullivan-Graham, and Dawit Mekonnen. I hope everyone here found these insights provided by our panel about the Water-Energy-Food Nexus just as fascinating as I did. I mean, this gave me a lot of material to think about in my own research, my own writing for the coming days. And I hope that it's generated for our audience a lot of creativity about what you're doing for your work. I want to remind everybody that this webinar is based on the special issue of IWRA's flagship journal, Water International. Hopefully we will also be having a forthcoming policy brief on the same subject, which will be eventually available on our website, www.iwra.org. Our publishers would like to remind you that for a temporary amount of time, this special issue is now open access, so please go search the special issue and download the articles, use them in your research, use them in your writing, use them in your teaching, use them, read them whenever you want, and please engage with this material. To remind you again, the webinar is brought to you by the International Water Resources Association. We are an over 40-year-old organization that's nonprofit, non-governmental, and focuses on education. We bridge disciplines and geographies, connect professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions who are concerned with sustainable use of the world's water resources. If you want to know more about the association or becoming a member, please go to www.iwra.org. We hope to have our next webinar in a few months and hope you can join us. And on behalf of IWRA and the Sustainable Water Futures Program, who had a lot, was the driving force behind the special issue and had a big role to play here with us in presenting this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.